The Healing of Peter's Mother-in-Law. This podcast is a sample Bible study for the desktop version of Accordance. It requires some knowledge of Accordance Bible software, but neither Hebrew nor Greek. In our study today, we're going to look at an important but relatively unknown tool for studying the Bible, parallels. Sometimes called harmonies or synopses, these resources place parallel Bible passages side by side for easy comparison. Observing the similarities and differences between passages can sharpen our understanding. We can see how different writers shape their stories for their audiences, or even how different editors chose to weave together various story segments. Now, these resources are available in print, but the very best ones tend to be very expensive. I recently deleted a book from a graduate Gospels course I'm teaching because the book listed for $130. I figured my students had better things on which to spend their money. Now, other books are available for the Gospels. They also generally cost less than this first example, but they all have the same limitation. Each is limited to a single version and language. Fortunately, there's a better alternative. Accordance Parallels. Here's the Accordance alternative, more flexible, more portable, and much, much cheaper, since it's included with every copy of Accordance OS X. Our first podcast on this tool, number 28, offered a nice overview, and you may want to review it before watching the rest of this podcast. For those of you who don't, here's a short intro. This workspace is divided into two zones. On the left is a regular text zone, and on the right is our parallel zone. In this case, it displays all four gospel passages related to Jesus' baptism, placed side by side. In addition to the primary English Standard Version, we can also add a second text, in this case, the Chinese CNV Traditional. We could have also chosen the NIV 2011 and the Nestle Allen 27th edition, or any Bible translation in any one of the 20 or so languages we currently have available. See what I mean about the Parallels module being so flexible? There are several ways to open a new Parallels pane. We can use the library, or we can use the File menu. We can also amplify any verse by right-clicking in it and choosing Parallels from the Lookup menu. We can also click, then choose a parallel on the resource palette. Oh, and yes, we can even search all the parallels at once. Now, we do need to remember that not all verses in the Bible have parallels. That, in and of itself, can be an important research point. If that's the case for a verse, Accordance even lets us know. Now that everyone is up to speed with parallels, let's proceed to our Bible study. In Accordance. The passage we're going to look at today is Mark 1, 29 through 31, the story of Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. Now, the first thing that I like to do when exegeting a passage is to brush up on the book's introductory matters, and that's especially important if it's been a while since I've exegeted a passage in a book. In this case, I'll select Mark, and then go to one of several different one-volume Bible dictionaries. You can see that I have three. I often like to compare them and to check the articles. Another thing that I really like for this sort of task is one of the New Testament introductions that we offer. In this case, Berkhoff or Carlson. Having more than one witness always helps because, of course, we can compare them and sort of get a consensus read on this particular book. Now, we won't take time to do that now, but if we did, one of the things that we would find out is that the word immediately is characteristic to the Gospel of Mark. It's a gospel of action, perhaps originally addressed to Roman soldiers or some similar audience. Now, having consulted these, the next thing I would tend to do is to go through and check the various superscripts. I can do this by moving my cursor over them and then noting what information appears in the Instant Details box. You'll notice that this particular superscript in the ESV, V, lets us know that there's a parallel. Now, we'll look at the parallel later, but for the time being, look at these other notes, because often translators will identify obscure words or translational problems in this sort of thing, and it's just really helpful. Now that we've done that, let's do a word study on the word immediately. When we do a word study like this, it's always nice to have a numerically tagged text because we can search for the key number. which is always more accurate than searching for the English word that has been translated from it. Here we notice we have 53 hits of this word in 52 verses, but that's not really what I'm interested in. What I'd really like to see is how Mark compares to the other Gospels. So in this case, what I'm going to do is to select Gospels for the range, do a search again, and then take a look at the hits graph. I'm going to expand that so that we can see it clearly. Notice that Matthew, Luke, and John use this word very rarely, but it's very common in the Gospel of Mark. As a matter of fact, let me collapse this zone and let's go to an analysis, or rather, let's go to a table. And we can see here that the difference between the Gospels is statistically significant. Even though Mark is a much shorter Gospel, with only about 19,000 words, it still has 37 total hits, or 1.91 occurrences of immediately, or more properly, euthus, for every 1,000 words. Well, that's enough to stir my interest. So let me go ahead. I'm going to dismiss this zone and this zone. I'm also going to skip to Mark and take a look at some of these occurrences. Notice that the word straight here is identified as a hit, and that's correct because you'll notice in the instant details box it is the translation of the Greek word euthus, even though it's not translated immediately. We would have missed that if we had just searched for the English word. And then what we'll do is we'll click through some of these verses so that we can see where our verse occurs in context. And you'll notice it's neither the first nor the last occurrence of the word immediately. When we get to our verse, which happens to be Mark 129, I'm going to shift back to the ESV text, and we're going to focus on the tool of the day, which happens to be parallels. What I'm interested in is whether or not this particular passage occurs in other Gospels. And of course, we already know that because of this superscript here. It does not appear in John, so I'm safe in dismissing this fourth column. And I will actually shrink the font size here so that we can see all of each one of these passages. Now, the purpose of parallels is to allow us to compare the different accounts, to note their similarities and differences, and to try and analyze them. I've prepared a set of highlights simply for this sort of comparison. And what I'm going to do is to go through and mark the unique words. For instance, notice the word immediately? That's unique to Mark. So is this one down here. That's unique to Mark. Also unique to Mark is the fact that this house belonged to both Simon and Andrew, and that Jesus entered it with James and John. So I'll mark that as well. I also see that Jesus came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. And what I'm going to do is to continue to note these similarities and differences, marking them with the appropriate colors, including this black highlight, which I've designed to indicate omitted passages. Let me speed up this part of the recording so I can show you what it looks like when I'm done. All right, I'm done highlighting. And you've probably already noticed that my highlighting was immediately reflected in the ESV translation that is over on the left. I want to make two comments about this kind of word level highlighting. The first is that it is specific to a translation. So if I shift translations, it's not going to show the highlighting at all. Here, let me show you. I will shift from the ESV to something like the Holman Bible. Notice, no highlighting. If I go back to the ESV, you'll notice the highlighting appears again. The second thing is that this highlighting will only appear when this comparative studies highlight is chosen. So for example, if I go to an inductive study, notice that all of the highlighting disappeared. Instead, the inductive style highlighting now appears. And this means that when I have comparative shown, as I do these various studies, it's going to appear in my text even when I don't have parallels chosen. That can be a real benefit if you're short on time for a study. What does this sort of exercise add to our knowledge? Well, let's take a look at the three Gospels. Matthew is known as the Gospel of the King because it tends to emphasize Jesus' royalty and his kingly actions. And along this line, we can see a couple of things that Matthew has done to shape this story in accordance with his theme. The first is that Jesus only has to touch the woman's hand. The second is that when the fever leaves the woman, he emphasizes that she rose and began to serve Jesus, whereas the other Gospels say that she began to serve all of the people who were with Jesus. Now take a look at Luke, the physician. Notice that he specifies that this is a high fever, a megas fever, if you will. And he notes the family's distress. They appeal to Jesus on her behalf. Jesus has authority over the sickness because we can see he rebukes the fever, and in that rebuke, the fever leaves her immediately. So he emphasizes that immediately she rose up and began to serve. And by the way, immediately is a different word than Mark uses characteristically, and it appears very seldom here in Luke. So what about Mark? Well, we've already noted the two occurrences of euthus, or immediately, in this passage, emphasizing this man of action, this person who has come to make straight or immediate the paths of the Lord. We notice also that Mark emphasizes the people who are following Jesus, thus stressing his leadership characteristics. And notice Jesus' very assertive actions here in verse 31. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Once again, Jesus is a man of action. The repetition of immediately here seems to confirm that this is indeed a gospel of action. The other thing I want to do before we leave this study is to make sure that you know how to add the text. And that is simply to click in the box that says Add Text. The Greek would be most useful to me, although if you're teaching from this and you have a mixed audience, let's say a multicultural audience, that would be a better expression, notice that you can also use Spanish or any one of the 20 or so languages in the parallel. Here's how the workspace actually looked on my MacBook Pro. I thought it would make a nice background to review the steps for using the parallel module effectively. First, review the book's introductory materials. Second, locate the parallel passages. Third, identify the similarities and differences. And finally, fourth, understand how the author shaped the story to his audience's needs. There are other parallel accounts that have much more dramatic differences than the ones I chose today. I chose today's example primarily because it was short enough we could complete our analysis during this podcast. I hope you've been impressed enough to make this technique part of your own regular Bible study. The Parallels module is included with every copy of the desktop version of Accordance. It's also easy to use, and with repeated practice, each biblical author's style and preferences will become as familiar to you as those of your own friends and family. This has been Dr. J for Accordance Bible Software. Thank you for watching this episode of Lighting the Lamp.